Yakou Furio is a character from the game Master Detective Archive's Raincode. Unlike the other detectives in the game, he doesn't feature heavily in any specific chapter. Instead, he's more constant throughout the story. Yakou is the director of the Nocturnal Detective Agency, which is Kanai Ward's only detective agency. He's also the only detective in the entire city because of the heavy influence of the Peacekeepers. Unlike most of the other main characters, Yakou is not a master detective. He is certified by the World Detective Organization, but he has no forte. This doesn't seem to upset him. He expresses his belief that detectives without fortes are no less skilled or knowledgeable than detectives with fortes. Yakou is one of the most important characters in the story, and today I'll be taking a closer look at him to unravel exactly why he's so crucial. Like all the other characters in the game, in the original Japanese, Yakou's name is written in katakana. This makes it a bit tricky to analyze, but not impossible. Let's start with his first name. This is similar to Fubuki's name in that it has a Japanese origin with several different ways of writing it. When looking through these different writings, several characters appear that could fit Yakou's character. First, there's the character for night, midnight, or late night. This links to the name of his agency, the Nocturnal Detective Agency. It would also contrast with Amaterasu Corporation, since Amaterasu is the Shinto goddess of the sun. There's also a character that primarily means arrow or dart, but can also mean to correct or to make something right or accurate. This could reference Yakou's plot to take revenge on Dr. Weska. The same character can also mean a solemn promise or pledge, a potential tie to Yakou's implicit promise to protect the city and those he cares about. Another character means old, ancient, and antique. Yakou seems like the oldest of the main group. The same character can also mean antiquated or former. Being a native of the city, Yakou still remembers what Kanai Ward was like before Amaterasu took control. He remembers the former state of the city and what it used to be. The next character primarily means space or universe. It can also refer to a roof or house and represent a home or shelter. The agency was like a home to Yuma, who had lost everything and could remember nothing about himself. This character could link to how important Yakou was to Yuma. Finally, the last character that could relate to Yakou is one that mostly means valley or ravine, but can also mean to reach a limit or a point of no return. It's safe to say that Yakou did exactly that with his plan to kill Dr. Weska and himself in the process. So basically, there's a bunch of kanji that could fit Yakou's name. His last name, on the other hand, is much more simple. Furio is a given name of Italian origin. It's derived from the Latin furius, which means furious. In the game, it's pronounced a bit differently, Furio instead of Furio, but that difference doesn't matter. This name ties to a hidden anger and fury rather than a more obvious one. This emotion drove Yakou to enact a plan to kill Dr. Weska, so anger is a pretty key part of his character. For my final verdict, yeah, the name fits. It makes sense. I've got nothing else to say here, so let's move on. Yakou's irises look like two squares with one inside of the other. To say someone is square or they are a square is to say that they are old-fashioned or boringly conventional. This would fit Yakou since he's constantly following the rules to avoid any trouble with the Peacekeepers. He doesn't even want Halara and Desuhiko playing a small gambling game because of the problems it might lead to. There's something else that interests me about this design, though. Another character has a similar design in their eyes. Yomi Hellsmile. It's not exactly the same. Yomi's squares are only outlines, while Yakou's are outlines with another square inside of them. The similarity in the designs of their eyes could reference how Yakou played directly into Yomi's hand with the plan to kill Dr. Weska. Yomi instigated him to kill the doctor, and although he didn't know that, he fell right into the trap by going through with the plan. Yakou also wears glasses, but there's a good chance they aren't actually his. During the flashback to 5 years ago in his DLC, he's not wearing any glasses at all. But there's someone in the DLC that does wear glasses, and that's the Amaterasu researcher that he meets and later ends up marrying. Putting the two side by side, their glasses look similar, if not identical. This makes it seem pretty obvious to me that he's wearing his wife's glasses, probably as a way to hold on to her after her death. This detail is pretty easy to miss. It took me a while to notice it, but once you see it, it's just really sad. Yakou has an eye tattoo on his chest. This could represent or tie into the perception and intuition he must have as a detective. Yakou wears a jacket with various different designs on it, and he carries the badge from the WDO on his left arm. The last detail of Yakou's appearance that I want to mention is the flaming skull design on the right leg of his pants. Fire is often connected to anger, especially when it's very strong or uncontrollable. Skulls are linked to death and can be used to represent it. So the entire entire design could symbolize how Yakou's anger consumes him and ultimately leads to his death. I like Yakou's design, he looks pretty cool. All the little details are neat to look at and think about. Yakou has a flair for negotiation, as mentioned in his in-game profile and displayed in his introduction. By threatening to inform the WDO, he convinces the peacekeepers not to arrest Yuma. Outside of this though, his negotiation skills unfortunately aren't seen much. When introduced, Yakou seems to be cool under pressure. Although he admits to Yuma that he was scared when confronting the peacekeepers, it didn't show at the time. He was completely outnumbered but still remained calm. In most other cases though, Yakou doesn't do a good job of this. He panics when cornered by the peacekeepers in chapters 1 and 3, and he also freaks out every time he learns that Yuma got himself involved in another mess. His ability to stay calm is only displayed again in chapter 4 within the secret lab. There, he seems surprisingly confident given the situation, especially considering how panicked and nervous he was in other less dangerous circumstances. There's a good reason for this though, since he knows exactly what's going on in the lab at all times. As the director of the agency, Yakou tries to act as a leader among the group, though he's not very good at it. He can't rein in the other detectives and keep them out of trouble, and this is something he expresses his frustrations about multiple times. In his Gumshoe Gab, he admits his disappointment with himself as the director of the agency. Also of note is that Yakou is an extremely cautious person. He prioritizes avoiding trouble with the peacekeepers. He urges the others to not get involved in anything. In chapter 2, after the end of the Nailman case, he suggests just laying low until the peacekeepers lose interest. During flashbacks to the past in his DLC episode, Yakou seems a bit different. He wanted to keep working as a detective to protect Kanai Ward despite Amaterasu's growing presence within the city. At this point, he hadn't yet lost his hope of keeping the city out of the company's hands. In the prologue, Yakou tells Yuma that detectives can't save Kanai Ward, and all they can do is take small actions to help the people of the city. This is a major difference from how he was in the past. It's during this conversation that Yuma describes Yakou as having the resigned smile of someone who's given up. At the same time, Shinigami says he has the ominous aura of someone who's seen a lot of death. Yakou says he tried investigating Amaterasu and unsolved mysteries multiple times, but it never worked out. According to him, Amaterasu would always get upset with him and he would receive a lecture bordering on torture. This could be hyperbole, but considering the way Yomi is, I wouldn't be surprised if he's being completely serious. These repeated run-ins with Amaterasu could have worn away at Yakou's determination and caused him to lose hope of protecting or changing the city. Yakou's in-game profile describes him as lazy and irresponsible, though it also specifies he seems this way at a first glance. This implies he's not actually either of those things. The perceived laziness could come from his caution and avoidance of the peacekeepers. His hesitance to cross their path could be misinterpreted as laziness and a lack of a desire to do his job as a detective. Calling Yakou irresponsible has a bit more weight behind it though. He definitely cares about his job as a detective, but he's otherwise a bit of a mess. His profile describes him as living an unhealthy, unkempt, and unsanitary lifestyle, which makes sense because, he's living in a goddamn submarine, and his living and workspaces are visibly messy and disorganized. He seems to have problems with both smoking and drinking. He's often seen with a cigarette in his mouth, and in the prologue, he says that quitting smoking is harder than you think. In his Gumshoe Gab, he mentions he's been drinking so frequently that it's causing money issues, which is definitely not a good sign. For all his flaws and shortcomings, though, Yakou is ultimately compassionate and protective. His profile says he cares a great deal for his companions. He provides support, reassurance, and comfort for Yuma throughout the game, especially by trying to help him regain his memories or reassuring him that there's nothing wrong with having no forte. Yakou's relationship with the other detectives is mostly seen in their DLCs, although Fubuki is sadly an exception to this. He helps Tetsuhiko with his plot to catch a thief. He knows about Halara's affection for cats and helps them care for a stray. He's worried for Vivia and tries to find him after he left the agency with what Yakou called a solemn look on his face. And the fact that everyone is so upset about his death shows that he shared important bonds with all of them. Yakou's panic about run-ins with the peacekeepers sometimes seems more about his concern and worry for the others and what could happen to them. In chapter 1, Halara asks if he would rather hand over them and Yuma to the peacekeepers. He says he would sooner turn himself in, but also admits he'd rather not do that either. In chapter 3, he urges everyone not to do something rash. He'd rather find a solution that doesn't involve anyone getting hurt or arrested. In his DLC, he protects the Amaterasu researcher from the man pointing a gun at her without even a second thought. Even though he didn't know her, or at least hadn't recognized her yet, he didn't hesitate to create an opening for her to flee. Yakou's strong protectiveness is a trait that lends itself to heavy guilt and regret when he's unable to protect someone. His guilt and anger over his wife's death and his inability to protect her in that moment are key to his entire character. Yakou has a pretty constant presence throughout the game, but he unfortunately doesn't have any showcase or feature chapters like the other detectives. He regularly discusses with the others about the unfolding mysteries. He also tries to keep everyone out of trouble, but that doesn't work. He first appears at the end of Chapter 0, where he saves Yuma from the Peacekeepers with his negotiation skills. He also gives us some background information about Kanai Ward, like how it's completely isolated from the rest of the world. In the prologue, he brings Yuma to the roof of the building where the agency's office used to be. He tells Yuma he doesn't want Kanai Ward to change because he thinks it deserves some peace and quiet, though he also says that things could be different now that there are master detectives in the city. Yakou introduces Yuma to the others, during which he reveals that he helped everyone into the city wherever he could. This shows he was somewhat active in the process of bringing detectives to Kanai Ward, even if there was ultimately very little he could do. When Number 1 gives a direct order to investigate mysteries in Kanai Ward, Yakou is initially very panicked and thinks it's better to just ignore the order. He sort of talks himself out of this, though, and he begs the other detectives to help him save Kanai Ward. Even though he's been beaten down and discouraged over the years, he hasn't completely lost his desire to protect the city and its people. In Chapter 1, Yakou assigns Yuma the task of gathering the other detectives, which directly leads to him getting involved with the Nailman murders. He's cornered by Seth Burrows, who gives him a 3-hour time limit to withdraw his detectives. If the threat of the young boy's father going to jail for a crime he didn't commit wasn't serious enough, then the added time pressure that Seth places on Yakou definitely is. It's during this chapter where we see one of the first glimpses that Yakou has something else brewing. After giving Yuma and Halara the location of the church, he takes something out of his coat and looks at it while saying he still has so much he needs to do. He's most likely looking at the letter he received about his wife's death. We hear from Vivia in Chapter 4 that he often saw Yakou looking at it, so it's safe to assume that that's what he's doing here. At the start of Chapter 2, Yakou mentions the Peacekeepers have been watching the agency more closely and suggests just laying low until everything blows over. But of course, he can't stop most of the others from going off and doing their own thing. He then makes the same fatal mistake of sending Yuma on an errand, which leads to him meeting Kurumi and getting involved in the situation at her school. In Chapter 3, Yakou and the others show up at the end with the culprits apprehended. He convinces the Peacekeepers to back down and let Yuma, Fubuki, and Kurumi go free. When everyone's cornered by the Peacekeepers, he tries to stop anyone from doing anything reckless. He specifically points out Kurumi's presence because she's a civilian. Here, Yakou tells Yuma there's nothing more painful than being unable to protect the one you love. On the surface, it seems mostly like one of the game's many suggestions that Yuma and Kurumi have an interest in each other, but it actually says more about Yakou than either of them. He even admits he got unexpectedly heated while saying that, so this implies it's something he feels very strongly about. This can be tied back to his wife's death and his inability to save her. At the end of Chapter 3, he agrees with searching for Amaterasu's secret lab, which can seem unusual because usually he would just reject this sort of idea outright. But it does serve as a bit of foreshadowing for the events of the next chapter because Yakou specifically had a reason to want access to that lab. Chapter 4 is perhaps the most important part of the game for Yakou and his story. He's briefly seen looking at the letter again at the start of the chapter before having a brief chat with Yuma and Kurumi. He mentions there's still something he wants to protect in Kanai Ward. When Kurumi guesses it's a lover, Yakou says she's close but not exactly right. He goes on to express how important the city is to him because he's lived there his entire life. As for what he wants to protect, my guess is either the city or the people within it. In his DLC, he tells the Amaterasu researcher that he wants to protect the city, which causes her to ask him to start with protecting her. Although his wife is dead and he can no longer protect her, he still wants to guard the city. Later on, he shows up in the lab. During this section, he seems far more determined and optimistic. This is a huge change from how cautious and hesitant he was to take any action before. I think it's either Vivia or Halara that mentions it was Yakou's orders that brought everyone else to the lab because they received the threat against the doctor. This on its own is unusual for Yakou. Based on his previous behavior and general demeanor, you would probably expect him to just ignore the threat and leave it to the Peacekeepers, especially since Dr. Weska is a researcher with Amaterasu. But instead, he told everyone to head for the lab. Yakou disappears for a bit after heading out as a distraction so that Yuma and Desuhiko could reach the doctor, and the next time he appears, he's been stabbed by the hitman. I cannot put into words how devastated I was when this happened, but the emotional damage I suffered from Chapter 4 is not the point right now. A bit later on, something curious happens. It occurs when Yuma and Vivia are arguing about investigating Weska's murder, by which I mean Vivia threatened Yuma's life to try to stop him from looking into it. They both hear Yakou's voice telling them to stop fighting and to face the truth even if it hurts. This causes a bit of confusion for the two. Vivia confirms Yakou hasn't actually died yet, he's just very close to dying. That leaves him and Yuma wondering why they heard what was presumably his spirit speaking to them. Later reveals give us a potential answer. The voice they heard may have been the original Yakou, the human one that died 3 years ago during the Blank Week mystery. If the homunculus Yakou we knew throughout the game hadn't quite died by the time Vivia and Yuma heard his voice, then the only other explanation is that it was the spirit of the human Yakou they heard. And the most tragic part of this chapter, of course, is that Yakou turns out to be the culprit. He murdered Dr. Weska as revenge for enacting a plot to kill his wife. He even hired the hitman on himself to cover up his involvement in the murder. It's also revealed that Yomi instigated him into killing the doctor, although Yakou was not aware of his role. Another curious matter comes up when Halara mentions that Yakou passed away a while ago. Even Shinigami states the question that this brings up. Did Yakou die from having his soul reaped, or was it the stab wound that killed him? That's left completely unanswered. Yakou's final appearance in the main game occurs in Chapter 5. He briefly shows up as a zombified homunculus, and he gives Yuma a disc that contains footage showing the death of the original Dr. Weska. Prior to this, Yuma also heard him saying his name several times. Yuma thanks Yakou for everything, which makes him pause for a second before he continues to walk away. At the start of the DLC, homunculus Yakou follows a voice that is calling out to him. As he walks into rays of sunlight, he sees flashes of the other detectives. He encounters the ghost of his deceased wife. Then we go into a flashback to 5 years ago, which shows how Yakou met his wife. A strange man hired him to look for her. When he found the woman, he decided to talk to her instead of calling his client. The woman, who was an Amaterasu researcher, assumed that the man was from a rival company trying to get her to switch workplaces. This turns out to be completely wrong when said man shows up and points a gun at her, prompting Yakou to attack him to protect her. After that, Yakou seems pretty down on his luck. His colleagues at the agency quit, he's about to lose his office, and someone just beat the shit out of him. Then the Amaterasu researcher comes to talk to him, and she asks him why he wanted to be a detective. He says he used to play detective with the other kids when he was younger, and he even made fake badges for them to wear. He told his friends they would be the detectives to protect the city, and even decades later, he can't go against his word to them. This is when the researcher shows him a fake badge, revealing that she was one of the kids he used to play with. She asks him to be her bodyguard because if he wants to protect the city, he can start with protecting her. This is something that evidently became extremely important to him. Maybe he felt like he was actually doing something by keeping her safe, especially amid so many tough times and changes in the city. As Amaterasu grew more powerful, there was less and less he could do for Kanai Ward. Back in the present, the spirit of his wife leaves a sample of her medicine with him, contained within the fake badge. She suggests that if it were completed, it could even regenerate the brain cells of zombified homunculi. She embraces him before fading away. Yakou's DLC achieves two things. It expands upon Yakou's background and character, and it also gives some hope for the zombified homunculi in the restricted area. To me, it would make perfect sense if a cure was found for them, because I just cannot see Makoto giving up on them without trying to help them. The DLC also shows the contrast between the Yakou of the past and the Yakou of the present. In the past, he was still hopeful that Kanai Ward could be saved and protected, but in the present, he's been beaten down and has come to believe there's very little that detectives can actually do for the city. In both cases, though, he still has the desire to help, as shown when he asks the other detectives to help him save Kanai Ward. The prequel story, How to Be a Master Detective, a Yakou Furio case, is not connected to the events of the game, but it still offers some important insight into Yakou and his background. The events of the story are said to be set over a decade before the game. Yakou is likely late in his high school years, as he mentions being a teenager and also talks about entrance exams for university. The story displays his time working at a detective agency owned by a man he at first believed to be a master detective. This turns out to have been a lie, and the man is just a regular private eye. During the events, Yakou gets caught up in a plan to dismantle a gang in Kanai Ward. He was used as a piece of the whole entire scheme, which makes him frustrated with the detective he worked for, for, though it also makes him admire the man a little bit. The story ends with Yakou saying he wants to become the kind of detective that makes people happy to have him around. Yakou's time working at this agency is referenced in his Gumshoe Gab. He also mentions a time he assisted with a murder case that made him really admire the detective he worked under. Working at that agency contributed to Yakou becoming a detective. It made the dream seem more possible for him. He even tells Yuma that if he didn't admire detectives or if he didn't work at that agency, he probably wouldn't have become a detective himself. Through this story, the flashback in the DLC, and the events of the main game, we see Yakou at different points in his life. In the prequel story, he's hopeful about becoming a detective and making a difference in people's lives. In the DLC, things have gotten difficult for him with the rise of Amaterasu and the Peacekeepers, but he finds some hope with the researcher who later becomes his wife. And in the game, we meet him when he's exhausted and beaten down from the loss of his wife and seeing the Peacekeepers grow even more powerful. It's such a tragic shift to see him go through over time, and knowing the way it ultimately ends is just heartbreaking. The primary driving force behind Yakou's plot to kill Dr. Wesker was a desire for revenge. Anger and grief over his wife's death fueled that desire, and it was all sparked by a letter he received from Yomi pointing at Dr. Wesker as the one that killed his wife. This anger and the resulting desire for revenge were what doomed Yakou. He knew he wouldn't survive because the poison gas would kill him. He hired the hitman to cover up the truth behind his death. The hitman's attack would make it look like he died from the stab wound rather than the poison gas. The decision to hire the hitman makes it seem like Yakou was intending to hide what he did. But when you look a little closer, you might start to notice some details that cast doubt on that idea. For one, within the Mystery Labyrinth, Yakou never appears as a mystery phantom. The phantoms are explicitly said to represent people in the real world who are trying to cover up the truth, so the fact that Yakou never appears as one implies he's not trying to hide anything. Following that, even after he was exposed, the Labyrinth version of Yakou was completely silent and didn't say a single word. The other culprits all spoke, the priest in Chapter 1, the girls in Chapter 2, and Icardi in Chapter 3. They all gave more information and context behind their crimes. These details revealed more about their motivations, usually in an attempt to justify what they did. But Yakou said nothing the whole time. If these post-exposure monologues generally gave some kind of justification for the culprit's actions, it's possible Yakou believed there was no true justification for what he did. Finally, at the end of most deduction denouements, the culprit looks upset or panicked when Yuma and Shinigami point at them, but instead, Yakou smiles. All these details add up and point to the idea that Yakou wasn't trying to hide the truth behind his crime. There's plenty of small hints throughout the game that Yakou has suffered some kind of loss. There are a couple moments where he's looking at the letter he received. Whenever he talks about the importance of protecting someone you love and care about, he seems particularly serious and passionate. These hints all come together and add more force and impact behind his plan to kill Dr. Wesker. But there is one big question left by Yakou's plan. What did he expect to happen to the others? It seems like he died with no plan for how the rest of the detectives would escape the lab. He had to have known Yomi wouldn't let them go because I mean, this is Yomi fucking Hell Smile we're talking about here. The simplest explanation is just that Yakou went through with the plan despite having no way to help the other detectives reach safety. This would make sense because he definitely wasn't in a clear state of mind. He describes himself as an empty shell after his wife's death, and he only just began to come out of that when the other detectives arrived. The letter about his wife's death just threw him even further into the pit of anger and grief. So it's understandable he could have been completely blinded by his desire for revenge. I do have a small theory, though even I admit it's a bit of a stretch. The key to this theory lies with Makoto. He had a role in the plan to kill Wesker, though his involvement was unknown to both Yakou and Yomi. He pulled the strings behind the scenes so that Yakou would hire the hitman on himself. He knew about the plot to kill the doctor, and he used it as a chance to remove Yomi from power. Even if Yakou didn't know about Makoto's involvement in the plan, he could have assumed or hoped that he would take the opening to eliminate Yomi and help the other detectives. In Chapter 3, Makoto intervened when Yomi and the Peacekeepers had everyone cornered. During the walk back to the agency, he explained the power struggle within Amaterasu and how he would immediately remove Yomi from power if he had the means to do so. This conversation happened between Makoto and Yuma, but Yakou was still there and probably overheard it. Yakou also knew Makoto was in the lab because Yuma told him that Makoto was the one that brought him there. This same explanation would have also told him that Makoto knew about the threat against the doctor. So Yakou had already seen explain that Makoto was at odds with Yomi, heard that Makoto would remove Yomi from power if he had the chance, and had already seen him intervene to rescue the group once. Therefore, it's plausible that Yakou assumed, or at least hoped, that Makoto would intervene in some way. Maybe he figured Makoto would take the opening to find the evidence he needed to eliminate Yomi. Maybe he only hoped he would prevent the Peacekeepers from hurting the others. Or maybe it was both. Like I said, this theory is definitely a stretch. Yakou and Makoto don't seem to have been in contact at any point, and Yakou didn't even know that Makoto was Amaterasu's CEO until meeting him in Chapter 3. So for Yakou to hope that Makoto would help the other detectives is pretty out there, but I can personally see how it would be possible. This whole thing ended up being much longer than I expected it would be at the start. So if you found it too long and rambly, I apologize. But if you loved it, you're welcome. I already loved Yakou before I started working on this, but then I put him under a microscope, and now I love him even more. I really, really wish he was even more present in the story than he already is, but obviously his current role was already enough to make me sob like a little bitch at Chapter 4. It really would have been cool to have a chapter where he investigated with Yuma just like the other detectives, though. His DLC is great, and I don't really have any complaints about it, and I really like how it gives some hope for the zombified homunculi. Overall, I find Yakou a really good, compelling, and interesting character, and he's without a doubt very important to the story of the game, but he just kind of feels a little bit underutilized at points. Like I said, I really wish there was a chapter where he investigated alongside Yuma. But yeah, that's about it. I love Yakou, and I miss him, and Chapter 4 ruined me emotionally, and I am still not over it. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and have a good day.